I was only 19 when the first strange whispers drifted through our regiment near the battered outskirts of St. Lo, drifting like smoke through the hedgerows and carrying with them the kind of uneasy curiosity that soldiers try to ignore but can never truly escape, especially in a season when every rumour has the weight of a warning. Those returning from the front spoke not with the confident laughter of men exaggerating a campfire tale, but with a low steadiness that suggested they were trying to wrap their minds around something unsettling, something that did not fit the orderly logic of the war we believed we understood. They claimed the Americans carried a rifle unlike anything we had ever faced, a weapon that fired with unnatural speed, as if anger itself had been trapped inside the wooden stock and released with every pull of the trigger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because, tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At first, almost none of us believed it, because German pride, even in those troubled months, still ran deep, and we held firm to the notion that our engineering stood above all others. We trusted the carabiner and all the familiar instruments of our craft, believing wholeheartedly that discipline, precision, and training outweighed anything the enemy could produce. But, as the days unfolded, the battlefield began telling a different story, one we could not simply dismiss with patriotic confidence. The Americans advanced with a steadiness that felt wrong, as though their rifles were guiding them rather than the other way around, pushing them forward with a rhythm that refused to break. Their firing did not pause, did not stagger, did not give us those precious pockets of silence that every soldier counts on to regroup or breathe, or simply remind himself he is still alive beneath the chaos. Even without seeing their weapon, we could feel its presence in the very air, woven into the relentless cracking that echoed through the hedgerows like a grim metronome, marking the cadence of our decline. It rattled against the stone walls, rolled over the damp earth, and seeped into our nerves with the certainty of a storm preparing to break. And each time the sound reached us, we looked at one another with that growing, unspoken question. How were they firing so quickly, and why did their volleys never stutter the way ours did? I remember one particular evening when a group of us sat on overturned crates behind a half-destroyed farmhouse, pretending to clean our rifles while the sun bled orange behind the distant trees. A corporal, mud still dried on his sleeves, told us he had seen an American open fire without ever touching his bolt, firing again and again with the kind of fluid rhythm that seemed impossible unless a second man stood beside him, reloading with supernatural speed. He described the scene with such detail that I felt an uneasy tremor move through me, yet another voice inside insisted he must have been mistaken, confused by smoke and distance and fear. But each day, more men returned with similar stories, and the pattern grew too consistent to deny. Still, we clung to our doubt, telling ourselves that perhaps the Americans carried more submachine guns, or perhaps they trained in ways that allowed them to manipulate their bolts faster than we could imagine. Anything, absolutely anything, was easier to accept than the possibility that every American infantryman carried a weapon that fundamentally outclassed ours. German pride, after all, is not easily surrendered. Then came the morning when the rumours shifted from distant speculation to something heavier, something that settled on our shoulders like cold iron. A lieutenant, usually calm even under artillery fire, returned from the line with a face so tight and pale that no one dared joke or question him. He reported that an entire squad had been forced back by what he described as a rolling wave of continuous fire, a phrase none of us had ever heard before. Rifles did not create rolling waves. Rifles barked, cracked, or snapped. Rolling waves belonged to machine guns, and machine guns required belts, positions, and setup. Yet the Americans had advanced with this impossible new rhythm, firing with the confidence of men who knew they would not be forced to pause or fumble with a bolt in the middle of a desperate exchange. That night, even the most stubborn among us grew quiet, each of us replaying the stories in our minds as though trying to decipher a puzzle that refused to reveal its answer. The air around St. Lo felt charged, heavy, as if the land itself waited for us to acknowledge a truth just beyond our pride. I remember lying awake in my shallow dugout, listening to the distant echoes of rifle fire drifting across the fields. The sound was unnervingly consistent, evenly spaced shots, deliberate, confident, like footsteps of an approaching giant. I told myself the Americans were simply coordinating better, or perhaps they had more ammunition to waste, but deep down I felt the first stirrings of a quiet, unfamiliar fear. Something in their rhythm felt mechanical, unwavering, almost inhuman. While our shots came in the irregular pattern of men fighting against time and instinct, theirs came with a steadiness that suggested certainty, momentum, and unbroken control. Even without understanding the mechanism behind it, the effect was crushing. By the end of that week, the rumors had grown into something like legend. Some claimed the Americans carried a magical rifle, forged by engineers who had found a way to cheat the natural rhythm of battle. Others insisted they had seen soldiers firing 8 rounds without stopping. Though 8, at that time, was merely a number carried in whispers. I heard a sergeant argue that the Americans must be using some new kind of light machine gun, disguised as a rifle, though he admitted such an idea made little sense. We argued, debated, and speculated, but no explanation felt satisfying. Every theory seemed to crumble under the weight of the Americans' relentless advance. Yet for all the rumors and speculations, nothing prepared me for the realization that would come weeks later, the moment I would stand behind a ruined barn and watch a captured American rifle spit 8 rounds in rapid succession, followed by a bright metallic ping that would carve itself into my memory for the rest of my life. But at that earlier time, during the quiet dread of those first days, I did not know the weapon's name, nor did I comprehend the shift it represented. I only knew that something unseen lurked within the Americans' confidence, something powerful enough to alter the natural rhythm of battle. And though I tried to dismiss the idea, a part of me sensed, even then, that our war had begun to tilt, not from strategy or numbers, but from a simple piece of machinery the Americans carried in their hands, a weapon whose name I would soon learn with a mixture of awe, fear, and reluctant respect. The M1 Garand. It was August when our unit ambushed a small American patrol near the edge of a shattered wheat field, and we brought back their equipment, tattered and mud-streaked from the struggle. Behind a ruined barn, we laid the captured weapons on the splintered boards, a makeshift display of our spoils, though none of us felt triumphant. Among the rifles, one stood out immediately, resting across the broken planks with an almost deliberate weight, a long wooden stock caked in dried mud, smoother in some places, polished in others, heavier and more balanced than anything we had ever carried. The sun caught the steel of its barrel, and the glint made our eyes narrow. Our sergeant, a man of 50, hardened by years of combat in Poland and France, gathered us around and tapped the rifle with the toe of his boot. "This," he said, voice low and deliberate, "is what's been haunting us." The words fell like a hammer on stone, and even the youngest among us instinctively stepped back. One corporal, barely 21, lifted the rifle with care, turning it over in his hands as if afraid it might bite. He worked the bolt, feeling the clean mechanical snap, and nearly lost a finger when it snapped shut faster than he had expected. We all flinched, stepping back instinctively, watching the rifle almost as if it were alive. Its weight was deceptive, balanced perfectly, almost tauntingly so, as though it had been designed not merely to fire, but to command. Even before the first shot, a quiet tension filled the air, respect, awe, and something darker, a nervous acknowledgement that this weapon changed the rules of engagement. The sergeant crouched beside the rifle and inspected it with the practiced eye of a man who had handled every weapon the Wehrmacht could issue. He muttered about the precise machining, the solid metal components, the gas-operated mechanism that cycled with uncanny smoothness. "The Americans," he said, "did not make a toy." We leaned closer, curiosity mixed with fear, tracing the clean lines, the trigger, the ejection port, and the clip. It was small but significant, capable of delivering 8 rounds in a single, uninterrupted sequence, 8 aimed shots faster than any of our carabiner rifles could manage with careful bolt work. As the sun climbed higher, dust motes catching the light, we began testing it. A volunteer fired a few rounds into the distant tree line, and even through the haze, the difference was obvious. Each shot came without pause, a fluid chain of destruction that defied instinct and training. The empty clip ejected with a metallic ping that echoed across the field and set our nerves on edge. Another soldier tried to reload, his hands fumbling at first, but the simplicity of the clip system allowed him to insert a fresh magazine almost instinctively, and the weapon resumed its rhythm with terrifying precision. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the shots rang out, a steady hammering that felt less like gunfire and more like judgment. The mood among the men shifted. Some laughed nervously, shaking their heads as though to deny the truth in front of them. Others, older men hardened by years of war, muttered that this rifle would force us to rethink every engagement, every tactic we had learned in the previous 5 years. The sergeant, usually so confident, glanced around at us, and for the first time I saw a flicker of genuine concern in his eyes. "A single rifleman with this weapon," he said quietly, "could hold back an entire squad, or more." We spent the remainder of the morning observing, handling, and testing the rifle under supervision. Each of us felt the subtle power in its balance and design. It was heavier than it looked, yes, but the weight added stability, allowing the firer to maintain accuracy even in a hurry. The bolt moved with near-perfect timing, extracting spent cartridges and chambering new rounds without hesitation, almost as if the rifle anticipated the shooter's intent. For men like us, trained to work manually, to labor over the mechanical motions, this fluidity was alien, frightening. I caught myself imagining an entire platoon armed with these rifles, advancing like ghosts through our hedgerows, firing not in measured bursts, but in a relentless flow that would leave no cover sacred. By noon, we had arranged the rifles side by side, noting differences, estimating the Americans' range and rate of fire. Discussions turned technical gas-operated mechanisms, rotating bolts, clip-fed ammunition terms that had previously seemed abstract now took on a deadly immediacy. Even the youngest among us, barely out of his teens, grasped the tactical implications. We could no longer rely on conventional strategies that depended on bolt-action fire. The rhythm, the pacing, the very tempo of combat had shifted. The M1 Garand was no ordinary rifle. It was an instrument of war that demanded respect, demanding attention to detail and tactical adaptation. As I held the rifle in my hands, the grain of the wood smooth and warm under my fingers, I understood for the first time the weight of what we had captured. Not merely the physical mass, not merely the metallic components, but the idea it embodied the relentless, semi-automatic rhythm of American infantry fire. 8 rounds at a time, then another 8, all without the pause we depended upon to regroup or counterattack. It was a revelation. I could see in the eyes of my comrades that the same realization had struck them, a dawning fear mixed with awe. We tested the rifle across different positions, prone and kneeling, and each time it performed flawlessly. Unlike our rifles, which required careful operation, deliberate cycling, constant attention to oil and dirt, this rifle tolerated rough handling, mud, and dust as if designed to thrive in chaos. The sergeant noted the engineering genius, tracing the internal mechanisms and murmuring the names of components we had studied but never handled. Every click, every snap, every metallic ping was a reminder that this rifle had changed the fundamentals of infantry warfare. As the afternoon waned, a hush settled over the barnyard. Each of us took turns firing, listening to the echoes bounce across the fields, feeling the recoil, observing the speed of reload, and sensing the lethality. The experience was both thrilling and disquieting. Some men smiled nervously, shaking their heads as though trying to laugh away the tension. Others were silent, absorbed entirely by the mechanical marvel in their hands. The rifle was more than wood and steel. It was a promise of dominance, a silent threat that would shape every encounter we faced from that day forward. Even as we packed the captured weapons, carefully labeling each, the rifle remained in the center of our attention, the gravitational point around which all discussion orbited. Later, as we trudged back toward our billets, I could not stop thinking about the weapon, about the implications, about the endless possibilities it created for those who wielded it. I imagined a squad of Americans advancing across the fields, each rifle delivering 8 rounds without pause, and a cold dread settled over me. Our methods, our training, even our pride, now seemed inadequate in the face of this new force. That night, in the dim light of our encampment, I lay awake thinking about the rifle behind the barn, the smoothness of the bolt, the ping of the ejected clip, the effortless, fluid cadence that defied our previous understanding of war. The soldiers around me murmured quietly, recounting their experiences with the weapon, analyzing its mechanics, and contemplating what we would face in the coming days. The M1 Garand had become more than a rifle. It had become a symbol of the challenge ahead, a herald of a battlefield where our familiar certainty no longer applied. I realized then that the war was changing in ways we had only begun to sense, and that in every hedgerow, every field, every ruined barn, the Americans carried not just rifles, but an advantage that we could neither ignore nor underestimate. We had captured it, yes, but its presence lingered like a ghost, reminding us that the rules had shifted, that every encounter would demand new thinking, faster reflexes, and a respect for a weapon that, even now, inspired both fear and admiration. It was mid-August when the sergeant finally decided that words alone would not suffice. We needed to witness the rifle's power, to understand fully the disparity it introduced. The sun had climbed high into the cloudless sky, and the barnyard was bathed in a harsh, golden light that reflected off the splintered wood and the rifles laid out in a meticulous row. Behind, the ruined structure, a shallow ditch carved into the earth offered the ideal test range. We assembled there, a dozen men, sweating in our wool uniforms, faces tense with anticipation and a mixture of awe and dread. The corporal, barely 21 and trembling slightly, approached the rifle with a reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. He loaded the clip, sliding it into the chamber with a click that sounded louder than any shot we had ever fired. A hush fell over the men. Even the birds seemed to have disappeared from the sky, leaving only the tense rustle of leaves in the wind. When the trigger was pulled, everything changed. 8 shots erupted in rapid succession, each one distinct yet part of an unbroken cadence. The crack of each round tore through the air with mechanical precision, and we could see the bullets striking the opposite bank, splintering the earth and scattering stones. There was no bolt cycling, no pause, no hesitation, only a continuous, merciless rhythm that sounded like a machine, but moved with the precision of a human hand. The metallic ping of the empty clip ejecting echoed across the field, bouncing off the distant barn walls, and reverberated in our chests like the tolling of a bell. We froze where we stood, hearts hammering, unable to move, unable even to speak. Our minds struggled to comprehend the simple, horrifying arithmetic. One American rifleman could deliver 8 aimed shots in the time it took us to fire 1, perhaps 2, of our carabiner rifles. The numbers were impossible, yet before our eyes they were real. I could feel it deep in my bones, the shift in balance, the war tilting in an instant. We had trained for months, even years, with our familiar weapons, our bolt actions that demanded patience, precision, and careful cycling. And yet, here was a single rifle that rendered all that training almost irrelevant. I watched as the corporal's hands shook slightly from the recoil, yet the weapon itself remained steadfast, perfectly balanced, each shot cleanly, leaving the barrel with a speed that mocked our experience. The sergeant, who had faced every imaginable battlefield scenario across France and Poland, drew a sharp breath and muttered, "So this is what we are up against." His voice was low, almost reverent, a mixture of disbelief and fear. Around me, the men exchanged glances that carried the unspoken acknowledgement of our inadequacy. The youngest, barely 18, stared wide-eyed, his fingers twitching as if he could reach out and touch the invisible advantage held by the Americans. A corporal who had seen the Eastern Front flinched, recalling the mechanized terror of Soviet T-34 seconds. Yet even those monsters of steel did not strike with the quiet, personal efficiency of this rifle. It was a revelation in simplicity and devastation, a weapon that demanded nothing from the user, except to aim and pull the trigger, yet it multiplied the lethality of every soldier who held it. The ditch where we had aimed, now pockmarked and scarred, seemed almost sacred, the ground bearing the invisible imprint of a technology that would shape every skirmish from that moment forward. The sergeant gestured for the rifle to be handed to him, and with careful hands he tested the mechanism himself. His experienced eye traced every line of the weapon, the bolt, the rotating chamber, the clip-fed system, and yet he shook his head slightly, unable to suppress the quiet awe that had taken root. "Ingenious," he muttered, almost to himself, his voice swallowed by the summer heat. We watched him fire a second clip, each shot landing with the same relentless cadence, and the metallic ping once more announced the clip's ejection, crisp and final. Even the men who had been laughing nervously minutes earlier now stood stone-faced, grasping the implications with a clarity that left no room for comfort. I thought about the Americans we had captured briefly, the men we had, ambushed weeks before, and how, with this rifle, they could have held an entire sector against twice our number. The math was unforgiving. 8 rounds per pull, multiplied by a platoon of soldiers, each rifle producing a stream of destruction while we struggled to cycle our weapons. The simplicity of the design, the reliability of the mechanism, and the deadly rhythm it produced created a new standard of combat. It was no longer enough to count on superior training, to trust in our tactical knowledge or positioning. One man with this rifle could dictate the tempo of the battle, decide who lived, who fell, and who retreated. We continued to fire the weapon, one after another, each man feeling the recoil, each shot embedding in memory like a hammer blow. The sergeant noted the speed, precision, and lack of mechanical failure. Unlike our rifles, which could jam if mud, dust, or sweat interfered with the bolt, this rifle tolerated neglect and abuse. Its mechanism was not delicate, it was resilient, almost brutal in its simplicity, and yet elegant in execution. Each shot reinforced the truth we all now understood. The Americans held an advantage we could scarcely imagine, a technological edge that shifted the very rules of engagement. In the quiet moments between clips, I found myself watching the weapon with almost a superstitious wariness. It lay on the ground, deceptively still, yet I could feel the latent power within it. The wood seemed alive, the steel almost humming with potential energy, ready to unleash death at a rhythm beyond human expectation. I could imagine a line of Americans advancing across an open field, each rifle firing in unbroken cadence, and the horror of it made my stomach churn. The sergeant's warning, spoken almost casually earlier, now rang clear. This is not just a weapon. This is a new battlefield. By late afternoon, the demonstration concluded, and we gathered the rifles back behind the barn, but the impact remained. Conversations were hushed, tentative, filled with speculation and disbelief. We discussed the rate of fire, the mechanics, the practicality, and the implications for every encounter we might face. A veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had survived 2 years of grueling combat, admitted quietly that he had never seen anything like it. Others murmured about the unfair advantage it provided, a rifle capable of turning a single soldier into a near-invincible force when wielded correctly. I could feel the unease spreading among the younger men, who were normally brash, cocky, and quick to boast. The realization that our familiar skills, our trained instincts, our very sense of rhythm in combat might now be inadequate was almost paralyzing. Even the sergeant, who had faced overwhelming odds countless times, stood silent for a long while, his hands resting lightly on the stock as if to draw strength from its craftsmanship. The ditch behind the barn, still pocked from the demonstration, became a symbol. In our minds, a small arena where we had glimpsed the future of warfare and the weapon that would redefine every encounter. As the shadows lengthened, the heat of the August sun fading to a cooler orange, I found myself reflecting on the scale of what we had just witnessed. One weapon, simple yet revolutionary, had redefined combat for an entire army. It was more than a rifle, it was a revelation. The Americans we had faced, and would continue to face, carried not just guns, but a philosophy of firepower that relied on speed, rhythm, and unbroken action. In that moment, We understood that battles would no longer be measured in tactics alone, but in the technological mastery each side brought to the field. Even as we returned to our quarters, the sound of the rifle's 8 shots echoed in our minds, a relentless reminder of what was possible. The metallic ping of the clip, crisp and undeniable, lingered as though it had imprinted itself upon the very air. Our discussions were careful, deliberate. Every man seemed aware that he had been shown something extraordinary, a weapon that would alter the fabric of warfare in ways we could scarcely predict. I traced the edges of the rifle's stock in my memory, visualized the rotation of the bolt, and felt the almost hypnotic rhythm of its fire, a cadence that had left no room for doubt, only respect and fear. The sergeant finally spoke, a low and measured voice that carried authority despite the weight of what we had seen. "Remember this," he said. "One rifle, one soldier, but multiplied by platoons, by battalions, by divisions, and we face a force that will test everything we know. Do not underestimate it. Do not dismiss it. Respect it, or it will bury us." The words sank into us like stones, heavy and undeniable. We nodded, silent, each man grappling with the new reality, each aware that the war had shifted irrevocably in a matter of minutes behind a ruined barn in August. Preparing and narrating, this story took us a lot of time, so, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Even now, decades later, I remember the demonstration as if it were yesterday. The rifle's 8 shots, the metallic ping, the ease with which it delivered death, and the stark, unflinching clarity of the imbalance it created, these remain vivid in memory. We were soldiers trained in the traditions of our fathers, yet faced with a weapon that challenged every assumption, every technique, every rhythm we had been taught. That day, behind the barn, I understood fully for the first time the terrifying power of innovation in war, and the M1 Garand became more than a rifle. It became a harbinger, a symbol, and a lesson we would carry into every battle thereafter. By the time September arrived, the Garand was no longer an abstraction, no longer a rumour whispered behind the barbed wire of our encampments or the fractured walls of abandoned barns. It had revealed itself in full force on the battlefield, and the truth was brutal, immediate, and unforgiving. Each skirmish with the Americans became a relentless lesson in firepower and psychological warfare. We saw their squads moving through the hedgerows, advancing with a confidence and fluidity that defied logic, a force that seemed almost impervious to our carefully laid defences. I had thought I understood combat. I had thought I knew the weight of fear, the rhythm of survival, the delicate balance between caution and aggression. But the first time a line of Americans crossed into view, rifles raised and semi-automatic fire erupting like a river of bullets, all previous experience dissolved. Their method was simple, almost mathematical, and yet terrifying in its execution. One soldier would kneel, sweep the hedge line with 8 shots, eject the clip, and a second rifleman would rise, the weapon's metallic ping momentarily cutting the air before his own 8-round rhythm took over. There was no pause, no break, no moment of vulnerability for us to exploit. Even the cleverest ambushes, carefully plotted over days, crumbled under this tide of fire. I watched men I had trained with for months, veterans who had survived Ardennes winters, Ardennes forests, the brutal eastern campaigns, falter and fall under the steady beat of the Garand. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. Morale shattered faster than lines of infantry. I remember one particular engagement near a small village outside Carentan, the streets narrow, filled with overturned carts and shattered masonry. We had positioned ourselves in what we thought was a defensible spot, a stone wall on one side, the ruined remnants of a half-collapsed bakery on the other. The Americans approached with the sun at their backs, rifles gleaming, and as they emerged from the cornfields, the fire began. 8 shots from the first rifleman, followed by the sharp ping of the clip ejection. I aimed my carabiner, fired 2 rounds in quick succession, worked the bolt, and hoped to catch him while he reloaded. But before I could cycle again, the next soldier had raised his Garand and fired, 8 more rounds ripping into the air, into the stone, into our world. It was as if the battlefield had contracted, our breathing slowed, our reactions lagging against the relentless tempo of their rifles. The hedgerows themselves, usually our ally, became traps. We would duck behind a thicket or a shallow ditch, thinking the foliage would shield us, only to see tracer lines skimming across leaves, bullets punching through mud and wood as if testing the limits of resistance itself. Our bolt-action rifles, weapons that had once felt precise, commanding, were now archaic tools in a war that had moved beyond patience. The simple act of cycling the bolt, once second nature, now felt clumsy, cumbersome, and lethally slow. One volley, a single Garand clip emptied, and we would scramble to chamber another round, only to hear the next soldier's 8 shots pierce the air like the striking of a metronome. There was no room to breathe, no pause in the onslaught, no mercy. The rhythm of semi-automatic fire changed everything, reshaping our tactics in ways we were slow to comprehend. Normally, our officers emphasized precision, patience, and the careful use of cover. Now, under the continuous and unrelenting fire of the Garand, all of that fell apart. Men froze where they stood, scanning for the invisible source of the rapid crackling, attempting to identify the American shooters behind cornstalks, ruined fences, or hedgerows that had once provided sanctuary. But there was always another, always a new burst of 8 shots, the metallic ping marking the end of one clip and the beginning of another. We tried listening for the sound of the clip's release, for that brief moment of vulnerability we could exploit. It was useless. By the time we reacted, 2 more rifles would have taken their place, and the cadence of fire never died. I could see the fear spreading through our ranks, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, until it crystallized into desperation. Experienced soldiers, men who had fought at Sedan, Moscow, and Normandy, now hesitated at the edge of the fields, uncertain how to proceed, how to survive. In small squads, orders were shouted, reassigned, ignored. Command fractured under the weight of continuous fire that required no pause, no calculation, only the steady, cold delivery of 8 rounds at a time. Even the loudest shouts, the most practiced maneuvers, became inadequate against the rhythm that refused to relent. We learned quickly that survival was no longer about accuracy, alone. It was about avoiding exposure entirely, about moving, hiding, and retreating before the Americans had time to complete their cycle. One night, near the banks of the Via River, our platoon attempted a defensive position along a hedgerow that overlooked a small valley. We had positioned 2 machine guns, believing that suppressive fire could counter the semi-automatic rifles. As the Americans approached, rifles raised, I watched in disbelief as their squads moved in concert. Each rifleman fired his 8 rounds, clipped and ejected with mechanical efficiency, while the others advanced. The bullets that missed the first line of men ripped into the trees, kicked up dirt, and cut the ground around us. Our machine guns roared in response, but we could not halt the steady advance. The Garand allowed the Americans to move and fire simultaneously, an innovation that rendered our static defenses nearly obsolete. The psychological weight of this reality crushed units faster than any physical assault. Entire sections began to falter under the unceasing fire. Soldiers who had previously been confident, experienced, and composed found themselves shaking, voices trembling as they called for orders, seeking guidance from officers who themselves struggled to process the new form of warfare unfolding before them. We tried to adjust, to adopt staggered fire, to coordinate flanking maneuvers, but the Americans' firepower made even the simplest tactics tenuous. Their semi-automatic rifles created a tempo we could not match, a relentless musicality of violence that left no room for human error. I recall an officer, Lieutenant Kreutzer, trying to rally his men in a field near Saint-Côme-du-Mont. He barked orders with the usual confidence, attempting to organize defensive positions behind overturned carts and crumbling walls. But as the Garand fire erupted, his voice faltered. He gestured, he shouted, he signaled, yet the rhythm of 8-shot volleys eclipsed his authority. Men ducked instinctively, hesitated, froze, or ran without command. I saw soldiers weep silently, crouching behind mud banks, realizing that the technology we faced was beyond our training, beyond the preparation of years in the field. Even Lieutenant Kreutzer, a veteran of 21 battles, admitted in private that the semi-automatic rifle had shattered the traditional balance of infantry warfare. In every engagement, the numbers revealed themselves. A platoon of 12 Americans, each wielding a Garand, could unleash 96 rounds in the time it took our 12 men to fire 24. Accuracy, training, or individual skill mattered far less than the simple arithmetic of sustained firepower. We were forced to recognize that a single Garand rifleman was the equal of multiple of our own soldiers in both speed and lethality. The advantage was not subtle, it was visceral, brutal, and immediate. Our bolt-action rifles, the pride of our regiment, had become relics in a war that had evolved overnight. The psychological pressure alone was enough to erode cohesion, morale, and even the will to fight. I saw squads that had once operated with precision, whose drills were flawless, fall apart as if invisible hands had loosened their bonds. The fear of the unseen, the unstoppable, became a constant companion. At night, around small fires, soldiers whispered about the Garand, about its speed, its cadence, its terrifying reliability. Tales grew, some exaggerated, but each one carried a kernel of truth. Men spoke of entire squads held in check by a single rifleman, of positions overrun not by brute force alone, but by the unyielding rhythm of fire. By the third week of continuous engagement, we adapted in small ways, but the lesson remained clear. The Garand dictated the tempo, the flow, and the limits of combat. Defensive strategies that had worked for decades failed. We relied more on cover, concealment, and avoidance, often retreating from engagements we would previously have held. Commanders debated, officers planned, and men fought, yet the reality remained immutable. The semi-automatic rifle had rewritten the rules. Every hedgerow, every ditch, every ruined barn became a potential killing ground where we were, perpetually one step behind, reacting instead of controlling, surviving instead of advancing. And so, the Garand became more than a weapon. It became a measure of our inadequacy, a symbol of technological progress we had yet to meet. Its 8-shot rhythm haunted dreams, echoed in the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, and the distant reports of other skirmishes. We learned to respect it, to fear it, and to adapt in whatever ways we could. The battlefield had changed, and with it, the balance of war. The Mon Garand was no longer an American secret or a rumor whispered among our ranks. It was the reality we faced at every hedge, every barn, and every river crossing. And it was merciless. By the time the autumn leaves began to turn gold and red across the Normandy countryside, a chilling realization had settled deep into our bones. The Mon Garand was no longer a novelty, no longer a rumor whispered through the muddy trenches or the shattered villages we attempted to hold. It had become a defining presence on the battlefield, a relentless force that reshaped the very nature of war itself. We had been raised with pride in German engineering, a pride that ran through every officer's speech, every drill, every meticulous inspection of our rifles and artillery. The bolt-action carabiner, 98 Kurz, with its reputation for precision and durability, had been the benchmark of infantry excellence for decades. It was elegant, reliable, and feared. Yet here, in the harsh light of the early autumn, that belief felt naive, almost foolish. The Garand did not rely on heritage, tradition, or reputation. It relied on innovation, on speed, and on a mechanical perfection that allowed ordinary men to unleash extraordinary firepower. We faced soldiers who, armed with this rifle, were transformed. I remember the first time I saw the pattern repeated across a broader engagement, a small ridge overlooking a narrow valley near Sainte-Mère-Église. Our unit, comprised of men, hardened by months of hedgerow fighting, had positioned itself strategically to cut off an American advance. We thought the terrain, our familiarity with it, and the superiority of our discipline would grant us the upper hand. The Americans moved in loose formation, rifles slung casually across their shoulders, yet every step was measured, deliberate, and terrifying in its implication. One soldier knelt at the edge of a ditch and fired 8 rounds in seamless succession. The metallic ping of the clip ejection rang out across the valley, almost musical in its cadence. Before we could respond, the next rifleman fired his 8, then another, and yet another. It was a chain reaction of firepower so continuous, so utterly relentless, that the ground seemed to tremble beneath the volley of bullets. Even our machine guns, emplaced and prepared, could not suppress the wave. We were forced to retreat, not because of numbers or courage, but because of a relentless rhythm that no amount of discipline could match. The Garand did not just fire. It imposed a psychological discipline on its operator, allowing him to remain calm, steady, and precise while delivering an overwhelming volume of fire. We, trained in the meticulous, deliberate art of bolt-action warfare, could not comprehend how a man, unhurried, could unleash 8 rounds, pause only for the clip to eject with a metallic ping, and immediately continue firing as if the world had been reduced to the rhythm of that mechanism alone. It was horrifying in its simplicity, and as the weeks progressed, we began to see patterns, to understand the terrifying logic behind the semi-automatic design. Each rifleman was no longer just a soldier, he was a node in a network of continuous fire, a single element in a system that moved with terrifying efficiency. Every clip fed seamlessly into another, every soldier backed the other, and every advance became a storm of bullets moving with a singular purpose. I recall an engagement near the small village of Garand. We had fortified a stone barn, thinking it would grant us a defensible position against American patrols. The hedgerows surrounding us, once our allies, had become a theatre of relentless exposure. The Americans approached with quiet confidence. One by one, riflemen fired 8 rounds in rapid succession, then another, and another, until we were pinned, unable to return fire effectively. The precision of our shots mattered less than the sheer volume of theirs. Even when we counted the moments between clip ejection and reloading, there was no window long enough to exploit. In that valley, the Garand had established a new law of combat: speed over experience, rhythm over tradition, volume over deliberation. The soldiers themselves became secondary to the system, yet the effect was humanly devastating. Our sergeant, a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, gathered us afterward, his face ashen. "This rifle," he said quietly, almost to himself, "will break many of us before the year ends." He was not speaking metaphorically. We felt it in our limbs, in our chests, in the jitter of nerves that persisted long after we left the field. Every encounter with the Americans became a mental exercise as much as a physical one. We were no longer merely reacting to a man in front of us. We were reacting to a technological doctrine, a system of warfare embodied in a single instrument of death. The Garand carried with it the weight of industry, the ingenuity of design, and the advantage of American logistical mastery. Every rifle that left the Springfield Armory, every clip loaded, every soldier trained to use it, contributed to a network of unstoppable force that we could not break. It was not only the battlefield that had changed. Our perception of combat, our doctrine, and even the value of our previous training shifted. We had been taught that discipline, marksmanship, and cunning could compensate for numbers. Trained to trust in the superiority of our tactics and the reliability of our rifles, the Garand rendered all of this partially obsolete. In practice, our drills no longer applied, our carefully rehearsed ambushes, our coordinated volleys, even our machine gun nests, could not withstand the continuous, overwhelming fire. The soldiers who operated the Garand did so with a confidence we could not emulate. Their aim, their timing, their composure under pressure were amplified by the rifle itself. One man, steady in his breathing and rhythm, could enforce terror across an entire field. I saw this effect most vividly during a skirmish in the dense woodlands near Pont-Hébert. Our platoon of 30 men had been assigned to cover a narrow forest path, a critical junction for enemy movement. We believed that our flanking positions, entrenched behind trees and fallen logs, would allow us to control the flow of movement. But the Americans emerged in pairs, firing 8 rounds, then another, the metallic ping marking the end of one clip and the beginning of the next. The forest echoed with the sound of semi-automatic fire, a staccato rhythm that drowned out even our shouted commands. We fired as best we could, but our bolt actions required several seconds to reload after each shot. By the time we had chambered a second round, multiple Americans had already advanced, their fire unbroken, their tempo unchallenged. The psychological effect of the Garand was as devastating as its physical impact. Entire units faltered under the unrelenting rhythm. Men who had faced artillery, tanks, and machine guns found themselves hesitating at the sight of a single soldier with a wooden-stocked rifle capable of firing 8 rounds in a heartbeat. Orders became fragmented, shouted across fields, misheard or ignored in the cacophony. Officers struggled to maintain cohesion, their authority undermined not by lack of courage, but by the inexorable tempo of fire that dictated battlefield. Even experienced 19-year-old soldiers, trained to react under pressure, found themselves frozen, counting 8 shots, then 8 more, the metallic ping punctuating every moment with cruel precision. By mid-October, the Garand had become the benchmark by which we measured every engagement. Tactics evolved to account for its presence, though never fully overcoming it. We relied more on indirect fire, artillery, and coordinated assaults with larger units, attempting to dilute the rifle's individual advantage. Yet, even then, its effect was undeniable. Small squads operating independently were no longer sufficient to hold positions, and even larger formations felt the pressure of semi-automatic fire on the flanks and rear. The weapon had forced a reconsideration of how we waged war, a recognition that firepower, tempo, and reliability could shift the balance of battle as decisively as numbers or terrain. I remember the quiet moments, those brief intervals between skirmishes, when soldiers would speak in hushed tones about the rifle. Around the dim light of a small campfire, men would recount the sound of 8 shots, the metallic ping, the terrifying rhythm that seemed to follow them across fields and hedgerows. Some swore that a single rifleman could hold an entire street or hedge line by himself, the clip cycling with mechanical inevitability, while the rest of us scrambled for cover. The Garand became a ghost in our minds, an unseen force that haunted every patrol, every reconnaissance, and every night spent sleeping fitfully beneath a tattered tent. By the end of the month, our concept of infantry combat had been permanently altered. The Garand had proven that technological advantage could reshape human behavior, morale, and strategy simultaneously. We no longer approached engagements with the same confidence. Instead, we planned with caution, respect, and a grudging admiration for the ingenuity behind the rifle. Our sergeant's words rang, truer with each passing day. We are no longer fighting men alone. We are fighting a system, a doctrine, an industry that works in unison through that rifle. Each clip fired, each metallic ping, reinforced the lesson. The Mon Garand was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of the changing nature of warfare, a harbinger of the mechanized, coordinated, and technologically driven battles that lay ahead. Even as we endured, adapting our positions, changing our tactics, and retreating when necessary, the shadow of the Garand persisted. In every ruined village, along every hedgerow, in the mud and smoke of our fields, its presence was felt. The rifle dictated the rhythm of life and death on the battlefield, imposing a tempo we could not control. It forced us to recognize the limitations of our training, the vulnerabilities in our doctrine, and the inevitability of adaptation. And while we survived, we did so with the knowledge that the Garand had permanently shifted the balance, that every encounter would now carry the weight of its semi-automatic 8-shot cadence. By the time November approached, the leaves had fallen, and the first frost dusted the hedgerows, a silent reminder of the relentless passage of time and battle. The Garand was no longer simply a threat. It was an institution of the battlefield, a standard against which all other weapons and tactics were measured. We had been forced to witness its power, to understand its impact, and to endure the psychological strain of facing a force that could fire 8 rounds before we had completed one. It was a lesson in humility, fear, and respect, an education in the future of warfare, delivered with the cold precision of American ingenuity. The months that followed would not erase the memory. Every soldier who survived carried the image of the rifle, the echo of its cadence, and the knowledge that the balance of war could be so profoundly altered by a single, well-engineered weapon. By autumn's end, the truth was undeniable. We were no longer simply fighting men. We were fighting the sum of American industry, training, doctrine, and the relentless rhythm of the Garand. And it was merciless, unyielding, and unforgettable. Decades later, long after the war had ended and I had built a quiet life far from the fields of Normandy, the memory of that summer returns with unnerving clarity. I am back behind the ruined barn, standing among my comrades, when the corporal lifts the captured American rifle, his fingers trembling with a mix of fear and awe. He inserts the clip, and the weapon comes alive. 8 shots erupt in rapid succession, each one precise, clean, and relentless. Then comes the metallic ping as the clip flies free, ringing through the air like a bell tolling doom. I can still feel the weight of that moment, the shock, the disbelief, the sudden understanding that we were facing more than men. We were facing a machine perfected to extend human capability. That single sound, so sharp and unforgiving, marked the turning of the war in ways we could not yet comprehend. In that instant, the illusion of German invincibility dissolved like smoke in the wind, replaced by the cold, undeniable truth. We were outmatched. The Mona Garand had changed everything. It gave ordinary men extraordinary reach, reshaping battles, breaking morale, and forcing new tactics upon us before we could adapt. Even now, decades later, I hear that ping in the quiet moments of my life, a reminder of power, of innovation, and of defeat. It is not just a sound, it is a symbol of change, of an era in which the future arrived in the form of wood, steel, and an 8-round clip. And I cannot help but remember it, over and over, in perfect, haunting clarity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.